Hello again, I'm Deacon Andrei Psarev, your instructor of Russian History 122, and I would like to illustrate strongly points that I made in my introductory lecture about what does it mean to study history. And in order to do it, I will be reading to you right now from the article of Father George Florovsky, The Predicament of the Christian Historian. I don't think Father George Florovsky needs to be introduced. I'm sure that you've heard of him or even read him. So Father George Florovsky was born in the Imperial Russia. He graduated from the University of Novorossiysk in the south of Russia, and as a young man he immigrated, and most of his life he spent outside of Russia. He never was able to come back to Russia after he left it, I believe, in 1920. So he became a very important link between Orthodox Christianity and the Western world. And as a link, as a bridge, he also worked in both directions. So in one way, in one direction, sort of westward, he was able to unpack Orthodox Christianity, promoting this as a true Christian faith, as the only church, the only authentic church that preserved true teaching. And sort of eastward, he exported Western critical thought and Western academic approach that he used in his reconstruction of what he believed was authentic Byzantine theology. So he's a really important figure for the 20th century, one of the figures that people outside of the Orthodox Church know about. So let us read from his article. Okay, Christianity is a religion of historians. It's a strong phrase, but the statement is correct. Christianity is basically a vigorous appeal to history, a witness of faith to certain particular events in the past, to certain particular data of history. Those events are acknowledged by faith as truly eventful. The scandal of particularity, to use the phrase of Gerhard Kittel, belongs to the very essence of Christian message. The Christian creed itself is intrinsically historic. It comprises the whole of existence in a single historical scheme, as one history of salvation, from creation to consummation, to the last judgment and the end of history. So I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to provide you with major snippets of this piece. So the study of history was vigorously cultivated by the liberal school since the time of Renaissance, Father Florovsky means, if only in order to describe history as a realm of relativity, or as a story of sin and failure, and finally to ban history from the theological field. This abuse of history by the liberals made even the lawful use of history in theology suspect in the conservative circles. So Father George saying that many people, many traditional Christians, they are suspicious about history, along the lines that I was talking, that some people would only prove a geographical version without any criticism, basically like a version prepared for edification. Was it safe, writes Father George, to make the eternal truth of Christianity dependent in any way upon the data of history, which is by its very nature inextricably contingent and human? For that reason, Cardinal Manning denounced every appeal to history or to antiquity as both a treason and a heresy. He was quite formal at this point. For him, the church had no history. She was ever abiding in a continuous present. So, kind of theological vision. After all, it has been persistently asked, can one really know history? This is the past. How can one discern without any decent measure of security what actually did happen in the past? Our pictures of the past are so varied and change from one generation to another, and even differ from one historian to the next. Are they anything but subjective opinions, impressions, or interpretations? Now, obviously, Christians, if they are believing and practicing Christians, cannot consciously dispense with their formidable bias, even if they succeed in preserving their intellectual honesty and integrity. Christians, by the very particular interpretation of certain events of history, and also to a definite interpretations of historic process itself, taken as a whole, in this sense, they are inevitably prejudiced. They cannot be radically critical. They would not agree, for instance, to handle their sacred books as pure literature, and would not read the Bible simply as the epic of the Jews. They will not surrender their belief in the crucial uniqueness of Christ. They would not consent to rule out the supernatural element from history. Under those conditions, is any impartial and critical study of history possible at all? Asking Father George. Can Christians continue as Christians in the exercise of their profession? How can they vindicate their endeavor? Can they simply divorce their professional work as historians from their religious convictions and write history as anyone else may do it, as if they were in no way informed by the faith? The easiest answer to this charge is to declare that all historians have a bias. An unbiased history is simply impossible and actually does not exist. In fact, evolutionary historians are obviously no less committed than those who believe in the biblical revelation, only they are committed to another bias. This kind of argument, however, is very ambiguous and inconclusive. It would lead ultimately to a radical skepticism and would discredit the study of history of any kind. It actually amounts to a total surrender of all claims and hopes for any reliable historical knowledge. It seems, however, that in the whole discussion, one operates usually with a very questionable conception of the historical study, with a conception derived from another era of inquiry, namely from the natural science. It is assumed in advance that there is universal scientific method which can be applied in any field of inquiry, regardless of the specific character of the subject of study. But this is a gracious assumption, a bias which does not stand critical test and which in fact has been vigorously contested. In recent decades, both by historians and by philosophers, so it was contested recently. In any case, one has first of all to define what is the nature and specific character of the historical, and in what way and manner this specific subject can be reached and apprehended. One has to define the aim and purpose of historical study, and then to design methods by which this aim or these aims can be properly achieved. Only in this perspective can the very question of impartiality and bias be intelligently asked and answered. The study of history is an ambiguous endeavor. Its very objective is ambiguous. History is the study of the past. Strictly speaking, we have at once to narrow the scope of the inquiry. History is indeed the study of the human past. An equation of human history and natural history would be an unwarranted presupposition or opinion. Much harm has been done to the study of history by such naturalistic presuppositions, which amount in the last resort to the denial of any specific character of human existence. Anyhow, the past as such cannot be observed directly. It has actually passed away and therefore is never given directly in any possible experience. To use the phrase of John Stuart Mill, the knowledge of the past is necessarily indirect and inferential. It's always an interpretation. So the history is always an interpretation. That's the model of history that Father George Florovsky is defending. The past can only be reconstructed. Is it a possible task? He asks. And how is it possible? Actually, no historian begins with the past. His starting point is always in the present, to which he belongs himself. He looks back. His starting point is in his sources, the primary sources. Out of them and on their authority, he proceeds to the recovery of the past. His procedure depends upon the nature and character of his information, of his sources. What are the sources? What makes a certain thing a source for the historian? In a certain sense, almost everything can serve as a historical source, provided the historian knows how to use it, how to read the evidence. But on the other hand, nothing at all is a historical source by itself, even a chronicle or a narrative or even an autobiography. Historical sources exist in their capacity as sources only in the context of a historical inquiry. Things are mute by themselves. Even the text and speeches, they speak only when they are understood. They render answers only when they are examined, as witnesses are examined when proper questions are asked. And the first rule of the historical craft is precisely to cross-examine the witnesses, to ask proper questions and to force the relics and the documents to answer them. The ultimate purpose of a historical inquiry is not in the establishment of certain objective facts, such as dates, places, numbers, names, and the like, as much as all this an indispensable preliminary, but the encounter with living beings. No doubt, objective facts must be first carefully established, verified, and confirmed. But this is not the final aim of the historian. History is precisely, to quote H.I. Maru once more, an encounter with the others. A narrow mind and an empty mind are real obstacles to this encounter, as they obviously are in all human relations. History as a subject of study is history of human beings, in their mutual relationship, in their conflicts and contacts, in their social intercourse, and in their solitude and estrangement, in their high aspirations and in their depravity. Only men live in history, live and move and strive and create and destroy. Men alone are historic beings in the full sense of the word. In the historical understanding, we establish contact with men, with their thoughts and endeavors, with their inner world and with their outward action. In this sense, Collingwood was undoubtedly right in insisting that there are no mere events in history. What is miscalled an event is really an action, and expresses some thought, intention, purpose of its agent. The historian's business is therefore to identify this thought. So that's what the quoted author Collingwood assumes. Historical vision is always a retrospective vision. What was a future for the people of the past is now for historians a past. In this sense, historians know more about the past than people of the past themselves were ever able to know. Historians are aware of the impact of the past, of certain past events on the present. After all, history is neither a spectacle nor panorama, but a process. The perspective of time, of concrete time, filled with events, gives us the sense of direction, which was probably lacking in the events themselves, as they actually happened. So historians are lucky that they now have a necessary perspective to see a bigger picture, whereas contemporaries, they only can see something around them or understand around them because they don't have necessary information. That's basically what many of us experience right now. We try to make our judgment about contemporary events without having full information available, and historians often are more lucky in this sense. A historian tends to overcome in a synthetic image the empirical complexity and often confusion of individual bits and occurrences, to organize them into a coherent whole, and to relate the multiplicity of occurrence to the unity of a character. This is seldom done in a logical way, by rational reconstruction. Historians act rather as inductive artists, go by intuition. Historians have their own visions, but these are transforming visions. It is by this method that all major generalizations of our historiography have been created: the Hellenic mind, the medieval man, the bourgeois, and the like. I would be unfair to contest the relevance of these categorical generalizations, which must be clearly distinguished from the generic generalizations. And yet, it would be precarious to claim that those generalized types do really exist. That is, exist at time and space. They are, as it were, valid visions, like artistic portraits, and as such, they are indispensable tools of understanding. But typical men are different from real men of flesh and blood. Of similar character are also our sociological generalizations. The city-state of ancient Greece, the feudal society, capitalism, democracy, and so on. The main danger of all those generalizations is that they overstress the inner necessity of a particular course of behavior. A man as a type or a character seems to be predestined to behave in his typical manner. There seems to be a typical pattern of development for each kind of human society. It is but natural that in our time the mirage of historical inevitability had to be exposed and dissolved as a distorting factor of our historical interpretation. There is indeed no inherent determinism in all these typical and categorical images, but they are no more than a useful shorthand for the dust of facts. The actual history is fluid and flexible and ultimately unpredictable. All historical interpretations are provisional and hypothetical. No definitive interpretation can ever be achieved, even in a limited and particular field of research. Our data are never complete, and new discoveries often compel historians to revise radically their schemes and to surrender sometimes their most cherished convictions, which may have seemed firmly established. It is easy to quote numerous examples of such revision from various areas of historical study, including church history. Moreover, historians must from time to time readjust themselves to the changes in the surrounding world. Their vision is always determined by a certain point of view and thereby limited. But the perspective itself unfolds in the course of actual history. No contemporary historian can commit himself to the identification of the Mediterranean world with the Cumena, which was quite legitimate in the ancient time. So basically, so it's not really equal to the entire universal world, because we now know that there are more countries and continents than people back then knew. It may even be suggested that a definitive interpretation of events would eliminate the historicity of history, its contingency and eventuality, and substitute instead a rational map of history, which may be lucid and readable, but will be existentially unreal. Again, our interpretations are also facts of history, and in them the depicted events continue their historical existence and participate in the shaping of historical life. One may argue whether the Socrates of Plato is a real Socrates, but there is little doubt that the Socrates of Plato had its own historical existence as a powerful factor in the shaping of the modern conception of philosopher. In fact, all modern philosophies of history have been cryptotheological, or probably pseudo-theological. Hegel, Comte, Marx, even Nietzsche. In any case, all of them were based on beliefs. The same is true of the modern substitute for the philosophy of history, which is commonly known as sociology, and which is in fact a morphology of history, dealing with the permanent and recurrent patterns of structures of human life. Now is man, in the totality of his manifold and personal existence, a possible subject of a purely historical study and understanding. To claim that he is by itself is a kind of theology, even if it turns out to be no more than apotheosis of man. So therefore he's saying there is not just purely technical process, but there's also particular philosophy behind study of history. Thus, contrary to the current prejudice, in order to be competent within his proper field of interpretation, a historian must be responsive to the whole amplitude of human concerns. If he has no concerns of his own, concerns of the others will seem nonsensical to him, and he will hardly be able to understand them and hardly competent to appraise them. A historian indifferent to the urgency of the philosophical quest may find with full conviction that the whole history of philosophy has been just a story of intellectual vagaries or vain speculations. In the same way, a religious historian of religion may find again with naive conviction and with an air of superiority that the whole history of religions has been but a history of frauds and superstitions or various aberrations of the human mind. Such histories of religion have been manufactured more than once, but similar reasons, certain sections and periods of history have been denounced and consequently dismissed and ignored as barbarian, dead, or sterile, as Dark Ages, and the like. The point is that even a pretended neutrality and alleged freedom from bias is itself a bias, so no one can escape it. An opinion, a decision, Father George writes. In fact, again, contrary to the current prejudice, commitment is a token of freedom, prerequisite of responsiveness. Concern and interest imply commitment. Now, obviously, one cannot be committed in general. Commitment is necessary, discriminative, and concrete, and consequently, not all commitments would operate in the same manner and not to the same effect. In any case, the openness of mind is not its emptiness, but rather its comprehensiveness, its broad responsiveness, or one is tempted to say its Catholicity. Now there is here more than just a gradation, as it were, in volume of capacity. The whole, to Kathalou, is not just a sum total of various particularisms, takata merus, even if these particularisms are dialectically arrived, as they were, for instance, in the Hegelian map of intellect, or discriminated a stage of progress, as was done, for instance, by Auguste Comte. Particularisms must be done away, and Catholicity of mind can be achieved only by a new integrating reorientation, which would necessarily imply a certain radical discrimination. For in the last resort, one cannot evade the compromise of more or less is just no in polite disguise. Accordingly, a historian, precisely as historian, that is, an interpreter of human life as it has been actually lived in time and space, cannot evade the major and crucial challenge of this actual history. Who do men say that I am? Mark 8:28. So this is the question that the Lord asked his apostles. For a historian, precisely in his capacity of an interpreter of human existence, it is a crucial question. A refusal to face a challenge is already a commitment. A refusal to answer a certain question is also an answer. Abstention from judgment is also judgment. An attempt to write history, evading the challenge of Christ, is in no sense a neutral endeavor. Not only a writing of a universal history, that is, interpreting the total destiny of mankind, but also interpreting any particular sections or slices of this history, is the historian confronted with the ultimate challenge, because the whole of human existence is confronted with this challenge and claim. A historian's response prejudices the course of his interpretation, his choice of measures and values, his understanding of human nature itself. His response determines his universe of discourse, the setting and perspective in which he endeavors to comprehend human life, and exhibits the amplitude of his responsiveness. No historian should ever pretend that he has achieved a definite interpretation of that great mystery which is a human life. In all its variety and diversity, in all its misery and grandeur, in its ambiguity and contradictions, in its basic freedom, no Christian historian should lay such claims either. But he entitled to claim that his approach to that mystery is a comprehensive and Catholic approach, that his vision of this mystery is proportionate to its actual dimension. Indeed, he has to vindicate his claim in the practice of his craft and vocation. Contemporary writers are even more emphatic at this point, for indeed, the rise of Christianity meant a radical reversal of man's attitude towards the fact of history. It meant actually the discovery of the historic dimension, of the historic time. Strictly speaking, it was a recovery and extension of the biblical vision. Of course, no elaborate philosophy of history can be found in the books of the Old Testament. Yet, there is in the Bible a comprehensive vision of history, a perspective of an unfolding time, running from a beginning to an end, and guided by the will of God, leading his people to his own goal and purpose. And this perspective of dynamic history, early Christians have assessed and interpret their new experience, the revelation of God in Christ Jesus. Classical historians held a very different view of human history. The Greeks and the Romans were indeed a history-writing people, but their vision of history was basically unhistorical. They were, of course, desperately interested in the facts of history, in the facts of the past. It might be expected that they would accordingly be well qualified for the historian's task. In fact, by their basic conviction, they were rather disqualified for that task. The Greek mind was in the grip of the past. It was, as it were, charmed by the past, but it was quite indifferent and uncertain with regard to the future. Now, the past itself acquires its historical character and significance only in the perspective of the future. Time's arrow was totally missing in the classical vision of human destiny. Great historians of Greece and Rome were not in any sense philosophers. At their best, they were fine observers, but rather moralists or artists, orators and politicians, preachers or rhetoricians than thinkers. Ancient philosophers, again, were not interested in history as such as a contingent and accidental flux of events. They endeavored, on the contrary, to eliminate history, to rule it out as a disturbing phenomenon. Philosophers of ancient Greece were looking for the permanent and changeless, for the timeless and immortal. Ancient historiography was emphatically pessimistic. History was a story of unavoidable doom and decay. Men were confronted with a dilemma. On the one hand, they could simply resign and reconcile themselves to this inevitability of destiny and even find joy and satisfaction in the contemplation of harmony and splendor of the cosmic whole. However indifferent and inimical it might be to the aims and concern of individuals and societies. This was the catharsis of tragedy, as tragedy was understood in the classical world. On the other hand, man could attempt an escape, a flight out of history, out of this dimension of flux and change, the hopeless wheel of genesis and decay, into the dimension of the changeless. Against this kind of background and in this perspective, Christianity means an intellectual revolution, a radical reversal of standards, a new vision and orientation. Christianity is an eschatological religion, and for that reason is essentially historical. Recent theological controversy has solely obscured the meaning of these terms, and some explanation is required to prevent confusion and misunderstanding. Time was in no sense devalued by Christ's coming. On the contrary, time was validated by His coming, by Him and through Him. It was consecrated and given meaning, the new meaning. In the light of Christ's coming, history now appears as a progress, inwardly ordered towards the end, to which it unfailingly precipitates. The hopeless cycles have been exploded, as St. Augustine used to say. It was revealed that there was no rotation in history, but on the contrary, an unfolding of a singular and universal purpose. In this perspective of a unique and universal history, all particular events are situated and in an irreversible order. Singularity of the events is acknowledged and secured. It has been in fact recently suggested that the Christian history is simply nonsense. It has been contended that the message of the New Testament was not an appeal to historical action, but to repentance, and that this message dismantled, as it were, the hopeless history of the world. This radical eschatologism, which simply dismantles all human history, is open to serious theological doubt. Indeed, it is a theological and not a historical assumption. It is rooted in a one-sided theological vision in which God alone is seen active, and man is just an object of divine action, in wrath or mercy, and never an agent himself. But it is this inhuman conception of man, and not the message of the New Testament, which makes nonsense of human history. The message of the New Testament, on the contrary, makes sense of history. In Christ and by Him, time was itself, for the first time, radically and existentially validated. History has become sacred in its full dimension since the Word was made flesh, and the Comforter descended into the world for the cleansing and sanctification. Christ is ever abiding in His body, which is the church, and in her history is effectively continued. It's obviously true that in practice it is utterly difficult to discern the pattern of this ongoing history of salvation in the perplexity of historical events, and historians, including Christian historians, including Christian historians, must be cautious and modest in their endeavor to decipher the hidden meaning of these particular events. Nevertheless, the historian must be aware of that new situation which has been created in history by the coming of Christ. There is now nothing neutral in the human sphere itself, since the cross and resurrection, since the Pentecost. Accordingly, the whole of history, even the hopeless history of the world, appears now in the perspective of ultimate eschatological conflict. It was in this perspective that St. Augustine understood his survey of historical events in his Story of the Two Cities. So, to conclude, the Christian historian does not proceed actually on Christian principles as is sometimes suggested. Christianity is not a set of principles. The Christian historian pursues his professional task of interpreting human life in the light of his Christian vision of that life, sorely distorted by sin, yet redeemed by divine mercy and healed by divine grace, and called to the inheritance of an everlasting kingdom. The Christian historian will, first of all, vindicate the dignity of man, even of fallen man. He will then protest against any radical scission of man into empirical and intelligible fractions, whether in a Kantian fashion or in any other fashion, of which the former is doomed and only the later is promised salvation. It is precisely the empirical man who needs salvation, and salvation does not consist merely in a kind of disentanglement of the intelligible character out of the empirical mass and bondage. Next, the Christian historian will attempt to reveal the actual course of events in the light of his Christian knowledge of man, but will be slow and cautious in detecting the providential structure of actual history in any detail. Even in the history of the Church, the hand of providence is emphatically hidden, though it would be blasphemous to deny that this hand does exist or that God is truly the Lord of history. Actually, the purpose of a historical understanding is not so much to detect the divine action in history as to understand the human action. This is human activities in the bewildering variety and confusion in which they appear to a human observer. Above all, the Christian historian will regard history at once as a mystery and as a tragedy, a mystery of salvation and a tragedy of sin. He will insist on the comprehensiveness of our conception of man as a prerequisite of our understanding of his existence, of his exploits, of his destiny, which is actually wrote in his history. The task of a Christian historian is by no means an easy task, but it's surely a noble task. Thank you very much for your attention. This text is available online, so that you can download it and read it on your own. So, but I hope there is a lot of food for our thought. Thank you.